college professor, an avowed atheist, told his class that he intended to prove to them that God didn't exist. Addressing the ceiling, he shouted, "God, if you're real, then I want you to knock me off of this platform. I'll give you 15 minutes. Lecture room felt silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Again he taunted, "God, I'm still here. I'm waiting." He smiled as he counted down the last couple of minutes. Near the rear of the class, a student stepped forward. He stood up. He was a big man, a Marine, just released from active duty. He was newly registered in the class. The Marine walked up to the professor. Without saying a word, he approached the teacher. He reared back and with full force, he hit him as hard as he could and knocked him off his lofty platform. The stunned professor just sat there for a moment on the ground. The students were shocked. The young Marine took a seat in the front row and sat silent. The professor looked at him and said, "What's wrong with you? What are you doing? Who do you think you are?" And the Marine said, "Well, God told me to tell you he was busy, so he sent me instead." Well, that may not be exactly how God works, but we're here today because God does have an assignment. God does have an assignment. And God has something that he wants us to do. And if anybody knows how that feels, it's this man by the name of Moses. This leader in the Old Testament, this prophet, this miraculous man who took the Israelites and led them to the Promised Land. As we look at our text this morning, Moses is about 80 years old. He's been a fugitive from Egypt. He lives with his father-in-law, Jethro. Jethro must have been a pretty wealthy man. Jethro probably had a lot of sheep, and Moses has been taking care of the sheep. And Moses is minding his own business, and in Exodus chapter 3, the chapter before our text, God speaks to him through a bush that's been burning. And God calls Moses into action. And God tells Moses it's time he got busy doing something for him. And Moses was not the best volunteer in the world. In fact, Moses does something I encourage you never to do. Moses argues with God. And Moses didn't win. And if you do it, you won't either. And Moses and God are going back and forth. And in the text, God asked Moses a question. And it seems like it's out of place. It seems like it's not the brightest question in the world, but it changes everything. God says, "Moses, what's in your hand?" Now, could God see what Moses had in his hand? Oh, yeah. God knew what Moses had in his hand, but he wanted to let Moses realize what was in his hand. "Moses, what's in your hand?" Well, Moses said, "I've got a rod." King James Version says a rod, the staff, the shepherd's staff. is what the Common English Bible says. It was not uncommon. In the 23rd Psalm we read that thy rod and thy staff, they comfort us, they lead us. David was a shepherd. David had a staff. Jesus is called the Good Shepherd, and he has a staff too, I think. The staff was used to guide and protect the sheep. So when God says, Moses, what's in your hand? God wanted Moses to realize that he had three things in his hand. First of all, Moses had his personality in his hand. When people saw Moses with his rod, with his staff, they automatically knew what he was. He was a shepherd. The shepherd would use the staff, the rod, to guide the sheep. He would use the staff or the rod to beat off predators. He would use the staff or the rod to get a sheep who had went astray back into the fold. It was the essence of who Moses was. Because, to be honest, the shepherd wasn't just a job, it was a lifestyle. You would be with the sheep more than you would be with people. You would be out in the fields a whole lot more than you would be with your family and your friends. Moses had become a shepherd, and it was all about his life. His whole life revolved around shepherding. Little did he know that God had in store for him to be the shepherd of millions of people. The rod also represented everything Moses possessed. To be real honest, the rod was all he had. Moses didn't even own the sheep. We're told that his father-in-law owned the sheep. He was just looking after Jethro's sheep. All Moses possessed was the rod. It represented his life. It represented his identity. It represented his livelihood. It was a constant reminder that he had never been able to reach his full potential. And y'all know why. 40 years earlier, Moses had been in the land of Egypt. Moses had been in Pharaoh's palace. Moses had all the perks of royalty. And yet, Moses didn't want to wait on God. And Moses got a little impatient. And one day Moses sees an Egyptian being a little bit hard on one of the Hebrews. And it burns Moses up. So he kills the Hebrew. From that moment on, Moses has been running. He's been on the run from Egypt. He's been on the run from that person's families. And he's been on the run from God. It's been 40 years. Moses is 80 years old now. And Moses sees this rod, and God says, what's in your hand? And Moses sees the rod, and Moses says, all I'm ever going to be now is a shepherd. This is all I've got. And he thinks about all that could have been. To be real honest, like Moses, some of us hold some things in our hands today too. Some things are good and some aren't. Maybe you hold the past in your hand. Maybe some pet sin. Maybe some hard feelings over things people have done or said. Unforgiveness. The sorrows of life. Feelings of inadequacy. Negative things. Maybe some talents, some natural abilities, some accomplishments. All these things, good or bad, identify us. And they control our lives. And God says, Moses, what's in your hand? And Moses realizes he's got his whole personality in his hand. Moses also realizes that not only does he have his personality in his hand, he's got his problems in his hand. He's got his problem in his hand. You see, when Moses heard the Lord's question, it must have stabbed him in the heart. What's in your hand, Moses? And the answer was a rod. Because Moses must have remembered when in his hands a scepter was there. Surely in his mind he went back to those days in the palace in the land of Egypt. He was being trained. He was being educated to be a Pharaoh. He may have remembered a time when he held the world in his hand. And now he's got nothing but a dry, dead stick. Maybe I'm talking to somebody today. And at one time you felt like you had the world in the hand. At one time you felt like you could do anything, you could be anything, but years went by, mistakes were made, and now you feel like all you've got in your hand is a dry, dead stick. That's where Moses was. That's exactly where Moses was. Because this rod identified all the problems Moses had in his life. It reminded him he used to be a prince. It reminded him that he now was just a servant. And it reminded him he was poor and he owned nothing. His life was full of potential at one time, but not now. Not now. Right now, Moses was a shepherd, and that's all he'd ever be. But God says, Moses, what's in your hand? And not only does that rod represent his personality, not only does it represent his problems, it also represents his potential. His potential. See, when Moses objects to God's call on his life, God uses a series of miracles to teach him the truth. That God is bigger than Moses' failures. Let me say that again. I want it to sink in. God is bigger than Moses' failures, and he's bigger than yours. And Moses, he remembers his past mistakes. He looks back to where he used to be. He looks back to what he messed up. And God tells him basically to go back and to tell Pharaoh to let his people go and to go and to lead the children of Israel. And Moses says, but God, not me. And God, they're not going to believe me, God. And God says, Moses, take that rod, throw it down on the ground. And it becomes a snake. The next phrase in the text, it's a little bit funny to me. It says Moses stepped back. I think the writer of Exodus was being a little bit undramatic there. I have a feeling Moses did more than just step back a little bit. I have a feeling Moses did a little dance like I did on my patio, if y'all remember back from last week. But Moses throws that staff down, that rod down, and it becomes a snake. And God asked Moses to do the craziest thing. Now, if it had been me, the text would have read, and then Adam fell over dead from a heart attack. But Moses didn't do that. God says, Moses, pick up that snake. You're talking about a tough call from God. And not only this, pick up the snake by the tail. Now, I've never held a snake in my hand. I never plan on holding a snake in my hand. But snake people tell you, if you're going to pick a snake up, don't pick it up by the tail. That's the most dangerous thing you can do. Because when you pick it up by the tail, You are in grave danger. You should always, if you're going to pick up a snake, how should you pick it up, by its head? But God says, Moses, pick it up by the tail. Why? Why did he want him to pick it up by the tail? Because he wanted to show him. God was trying to show Moses, you're going to have to trust me. You're going to have to put your whole faith, your whole confidence in me, and you can't put your confidence in yourself. You can't put your confidence in your knowledge. You can't put confidence in anything else, Moses, but me. Now pick it up by the tail. And in one of the greatest moments of Moses' life, I think, in one of the greatest testimonies of Moses' faith, he reaches down and picks it up by the tail. And what happens to it? It becomes a staff. I think that would have convinced me. I don't know. It didn't convince Moses. So God says, well Moses, put your hand in the cup. So Moses does. Take it out. And he looks at his hand. This translation that I read from says he had a skin disease, white and flaky. Your Bible may have said it was leprosy. That was a dreaded disease. And he looks at his hand and it's become leprous. God says, okay, Moses, put it back. Moses does. Take it out. He's clean again. Amazing. Moses, take some water from the Nile. Puts it in a jar. Fix it. Moses, put the water down on the dry ground. He pours it out, and all of a sudden it's blood. God was saying, Moses, you've got this staff, but more importantly, you've got me. More importantly, you've got me. You've got a God that's bigger than anything you'll ever face. Moses, it's time you went to do what I've called you to do. And Moses takes that staff and he goes back to Egypt. He goes back to Egypt. And God would take that staff and use it to turn the waters of Egypt into blood. God would take that staff and use it to bring forth the plague of frogs. God would take that staff and use it to bring forth the plague of lice. God would take that staff and use it to bring forth the plague of hail, of thunder, to call in the locusts, to part the Red Sea, to make the Red Sea go back together. God would use it to strike the rock and bring water from it in the desert. Moses, what's in your hand? A rod. Moses, I'm going to take that rod and I'm going to take you and we're going to change the world. What's in your hand this morning? What's in your hand that God can use to change the world? What's in your hand this morning that God can use that maybe represents some hurt in your life? That maybe represents some failure? But when you bring it to the Master, He can take it and He can use it to change the world. Moses climbed that mountain that day with a dead stick. He had been carrying around that dead stick for 40 years. And all that time he's used the stick. But that stick had also used Moses. The stick identified him. The stick controlled his life. The stick said, all you're ever going to be is a shepherd keeping another man's sheep. That stick was a problem for Moses, and he didn't even realize it. He believed it was an indispensable part of his life and his work, and Moses never knew until he yielded that stick to God that what he held in his hand was the key to God's power in his life. What's in your hand? What do you carry every day? What defines you? What are you holding on to that holds you back and keeps you from being everything God saved you to be? When you hold it, it's a liability. But when you give it to God, He can use it to change the world. What's in your hand?